My name is Fidelia Rose. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe with words like steady, reasonable, and low maintenance. I live a quiet life in a coastal town in the Pacific Northwest. I work as a financial compliance analyst, one of those jobs most people don't quite understand, but assume must involve a lot of spreadsheets and quiet concentration. They're not entirely wrong. If you ask the people around me, friends, neighbors, even my husband, they would probably say I'm calm to a fault, the kind of person who doesn't raise her voice, the kind who listens more than she speaks, the kind who, when something uncomfortable happens, pauses before reacting. Over the years, I learned that when someone behaves that way long enough, people begin to make assumptions about them. They assume you don't notice things. They assume you won't question things. And eventually, they assume you won't challenge anything at all. My husband traveled a lot for work. At least that's what I believed. Every few weeks, sometimes every month, he would pack the same Navy carry-on suitcase and fly to the same city for what he called business trips. For years, I never questioned it. Not because I was naive, not because I was blind, but because trust, real trust, is quiet. It doesn't interrogate every detail. It doesn't inspect every receipt or double-check every story. When you build a life with someone, you learn to accept certain rhythms as normal. And his travel schedule eventually became one of those rhythms. A flight on Friday afternoon, a short message that he'd landed safely, a few photos of hotel breakfasts or conference rooms, then return home Sunday night with stories about meetings and long workdays. It looked ordinary. It sounded ordinary. And for a very long time, it felt ordinary too. Until one evening when I was sorting through the week's expenses, a habit left over from my job, I noticed something small. Not dramatic, not shocking, just a single detail on a receipt. A detail so minor that most people would have ignored it without a second thought. But numbers are my profession. Patterns are what I'm trained to see. And the moment I noticed that one tiny inconsistency, something in my mind refused to let it go. That was the moment the questions started. Not loudly, not angrily, just quietly and persistently. What followed wasn't a story about revenge or dramatic confrontations. It was something slower, more complicated, and, if I'm being honest, far more revealing about human behavior than I ever expected. This is the story of how one small detail changed the way I saw my marriage, and the choices I made once I understood the truth. Before we begin, I'm curious about something. Have you ever had a moment where a single tiny detail made you suddenly question something you had trusted for years? For most of my marriage, I existed in a role that people rarely question. I was the reliable one, not the dramatic one, not the unpredictable one, just the person who kept things steady. If you had met my husband and me at a dinner party 5 years ago, you probably would have formed an opinion about us within 10 minutes. He was the engaging one, the storyteller, the man who could talk easily with strangers and make them laugh within moments. And I was the woman sitting beside him, smiling politely, occasionally adding a small comment when someone asked me a direct question. People often mistook that dynamic for something else. They assumed he was the center of the relationship, and I was orbiting quietly around him. I never corrected them, not because it bothered me, but because I understood something most people don't notice. The loudest person in the room isn't always the one paying attention. My husband, Daniel, worked in corporate logistics consulting. At least that's the simplest way to describe it. His job required frequent travel to meet clients, review operations, and present efficiency strategies. It sounded important, complicated, slightly mysterious. And over the years, those trips became part of the structure of our life together. Friends would ask, "Isn't it hard with him traveling so much?" I always gave the same answer: "You get used to it." And I had. There was a certain rhythm to his departures. Friday afternoons were usually the busiest part of the week for me, but I would still pause around 3 o'clock when I heard the soft click of his suitcase handle extending in the hallway. He always packed the same way: neatly folded shirts, laptop charger, travel-size cologne. The navy suitcase had a small scuff mark near one corner from a trip years ago. I remember noticing it once while helping him lift it into the trunk of the car. Small details tend to stay in my memory. Before leaving, he would always lean into the kitchen doorway and say something like, "Back Sunday night. Sometimes he would kiss the top of my head while I was reading or checking work emails, and then he would leave. At first, during the early years of our marriage, I would track his flights in my mind, wonder what he was doing in different cities, ask about the meetings when he comes home. But after a while, that curiosity faded into routine. He traveled, I worked, life continued. Our friends admired what they called our independence. One of my coworkers once said, "Honestly, your marriage sounds ideal. You both have your own space." I smiled when she said that, because in some ways, it was true. Our home was peaceful, predictable, calm, but there's another side to being the quiet person in a relationship. People sometimes assume your calmness means you're not paying attention. They assume that because you don't interrogate every detail, you must not notice details at all. Daniel believed that too. Over time, I could see it in the way he spoke to me about his trips. The explanations became shorter. The stories became more general. Instead of describing specific meetings or clients, he would say things like, "just the usual stuff," or "nothing exciting." At the time, I accepted those answers without hesitation. Not because I didn't care, but because I trusted him. And trust, when it's genuine, rarely demands proof. Looking back now, I can see something I didn't fully recognize then. To Daniel, and maybe to others around us, I had become a very specific kind of person in their minds. The calm wife, the understanding one, the woman who never asked too many questions, the woman who would simply keep the house warm while he traveled. What none of them realized was that quiet people often see far more than they say. They just wait longer before deciding what those observations mean. And the first observation that ever made me pause happened on an evening that seemed completely ordinary. The first moment that unsettled me didn't feel important at the time. In fact, if you had asked me that night whether anything unusual had happened, I probably would have said no. It was a Tuesday evening in early October, the kind of evening that arrives quietly in Seattle, rain tapping softly against the windows, the sky turning dark earlier than you expect. Daniel had returned from one of his weekend trips 2 days earlier. His suitcase was still partially unpacked in the bedroom, something that had become normal for him. He always said he liked to settle back into the week before dealing with it. I was sitting at the dining table with my laptop open, reviewing a set of expense reports from work. Numbers have always calmed me. There's something reassuring about data behaving the way it should. Patterns make sense, irregularities stand out. That night, Daniel walked into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. "Long day?" he asked. "Just reviewing a report," I said. He leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone while I finished entering a few numbers into a spreadsheet. Eventually, I closed my laptop and started gathering the small pile of receipts and notes I had been working with. That's when he casually dropped a receipt on the table beside me. "Can you add this to the expense file?" he said. It wasn't unusual. Sometimes his company reimbursed travel costs, and I was better at organizing documents than he was. I picked up the receipt without really looking at it. But then my eyes paused on one line. It was from a restaurant, a small place in Portland, the city he said he had visited that weekend. I recognized the name because I tend to remember locations easily. What caught my attention wasn't the restaurant itself. It was the timestamp, 10:47 p.m. I looked at it for a moment longer than necessary. Daniel had told me he'd had dinner with colleagues after a meeting that day. That part made sense, but the receipt listed 2 entrees and 2 glasses of wine. Again, that could still have been perfectly normal. Business dinners happen all the time. So I asked a simple question. "Was this the dinner with your client?" I said, turning the receipt slightly so he could see it. He glanced at it briefly. "Yeah, something like that," he said. Something about the answer felt imprecise, not wrong, just vague. I noticed it the way you notice a tiny scratch on a glass table. You can still use the table. It still looks fine from a distance. But once you've seen the mark, you know it's there. I placed the receipt beside my laptop. "Looks like a nice place," I said. "It was fine," he replied. Then he changed the subject. "Are we still seeing Mark and Julia this weekend?" The conversation moved on. We talked about plans, groceries, and a movie we might watch later. Nothing dramatic happened, no argument, no accusation, just an ordinary evening. But later that night, while brushing my teeth in the bathroom, I found myself replaying something in my mind. Not the receipt, not the dinner, just the way Daniel had answered the question. "Yeah, something like that." It wasn't the words. It was the distance between them. For the first time in years, I felt a small, quiet hesitation settle somewhere in the back of my thoughts. Not suspicion, not yet, just awareness, the kind that appears when something doesn't quite align, but you're not sure why. Most people would have forgotten about it by the next morning. In fact, that's probably what Daniel expected. And for a while, I tried to forget it too. But the strange thing about small details is that they don't disappear easily once your mind has noticed them. They stay somewhere in the background, waiting. Waiting for the next piece of the pattern to appear. For a few days after that receipt, I told myself it didn't matter, not in a forced way, not the kind of denial people sometimes use when they're trying to avoid the truth. Just a quiet, reasonable explanation. Business dinners happen, colleagues share meals, receipts aren't always detailed. It was a small thing, too small to disturb the shape of a life that had been stable for years. So I did what most people do when a question appears without an answer. I folded it neatly and placed it somewhere in the back of my mind. Life continued the way it always had. Daniel left early for work most mornings, coffee in one hand and his laptop bag over his shoulder. I worked from home 3 days a week and commuted downtown the other two. Our evenings were calm, dinner, a short walk if the rain paused. Sometimes a show plays quietly in the background while we both check emails or read. From the outside, nothing had changed. But subtle things began to repeat themselves in ways I hadn't fully noticed before. It started with small conversations. One evening, a few weeks later, we were sitting at the kitchen island while I sliced vegetables for dinner. Daniel was describing an upcoming trip, another weekend in Portland. Same client? I asked. Yeah, he said without looking up from his phone. What company was that again? He paused for a second. Then he gave a short laugh. You always ask that, he said lightly. It's just logistics consulting stuff. Boring. The answer wasn't rude, but it ended the conversation. I nodded and continued cutting the carrots into even pieces. Moments like that happen more often than I had realized. Whenever I asked about details, names, locations, the structure of a meeting, Daniel would respond with something vague enough to close the topic. Just a routine review. Nothing you'd find interesting. Same as usual. None of those responses sounded suspicious on their own. But over time, they had a subtle effect. They trained me not to ask. Not because he demanded silence, but because curiosity gradually felt unnecessary. I think many people in long relationships recognize this pattern. Conversations simplify, explanations shorten, and eventually certain areas of life become quietly off limits, not through rules but through repetition. Daniel wasn't cruel about it. In fact, he was often affectionate in other ways. He remembered to bring me my favorite tea from the grocery store. He sent the occasional message during work trips. Landed safely. From a distance, our relationship still looked thoughtful and respectful, but respect doesn't always disappear dramatically. Sometimes it fades through assumptions. And one assumption had clearly taken root in Daniel's mind. He believed I didn't need explanations, or maybe he believed I wouldn't examine them closely. Either way, the pattern had been set, and I had allowed it. Not because I lacked confidence, but peace in a home often depends on choosing which small moments are worth disrupting. For years, I chose quiet understanding. But every pattern, no matter how subtle, eventually reaches a moment where it becomes visible. For me, that moment arrived during another ordinary conversation. A conversation where Daniel said something so casually that he probably forgot it seconds later. But the moment the words left his mouth, I felt something shift. Not anger, not suspicion, just the quiet realization that the version of me he believed existed wasn't entirely accurate anymore. And once that realization appeared, it became impossible to ignore. The moment I began to understand the role I had been placed in didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no dramatic realization. It happened during a small gathering at our friend's apartment one Saturday evening. Mark and Julia hosted dinners often. They were the kind of couple who enjoyed bringing people together. Wine on the table, soft music in the background, a mix of conversations drifting between the kitchen and the living room. Daniel and I had known them for years. That night, there were 6 of us sitting around the dining table. The conversation moved easily between work stories, travel plans, and the usual debates about which city had the best restaurants. Daniel, as always, was in his element. He told a long story about a complicated client situation that had happened during one of his recent trips. Everyone laughed in the right places while he explained how he had solved the problem. Julia turned to me halfway through the story. "Doesn't it drive you crazy when he's gone so much?" she asked. Her tone wasn't judgmental, just curious. Before I could answer, Daniel responded first. "Oh, Fidelia doesn't mind," he said with a small smile. "She likes the quiet." Everyone laughed lightly, including me. But I noticed something subtle in the way he said it. It wasn't just an observation. It sounded like a definition, as if he were describing a personality trait he had already decided was true. Fidelia likes the quiet. In many ways, that statement was accurate. I do like quiet spaces. I enjoy long evenings reading or working without noise around me. But what struck me in that moment was the confidence in his voice. He wasn't guessing. He was certain. And I realized that over the years, Daniel had gradually created a version of me in his mind, a simplified version that made our life easier for him to navigate. In that version, I didn't ask too many questions. I didn't challenge his explanations, and I certainly didn't examine the details of his trips. I was the calm wife who kept everything steady at home, reliable, supportive, invisible when necessary. That role had developed slowly, shaped by hundreds of small moments where I chose patience over curiosity. And to be fair, I had played the role willingly, not because I lacked intelligence, but because peace often grows in quiet spaces. Still, sitting at that dinner table, listening to Daniel describe me so confidently, I felt something unusual. It wasn't resentment, it was awareness. The realization that the person he believed I was might not be the person I actually had become. After dinner, while everyone moved into the living room for dessert, I stepped onto the balcony for a moment of fresh air. The city lights reflected faintly off the wet streets below. Inside, I could hear Daniel continuing his story, his voice carrying easily above the others. For the first time, I wondered something I had never seriously considered before. Not what Daniel was doing during those trips, but why did he feel so comfortable assuming I would never ask? It wasn't an accusation, just a question. And once that question appeared, it quietly rearranged the way I saw everything that followed. Because roles, once assigned, tend to shape behavior on both sides. Daniel had grown comfortable with the quiet version of me. What he didn't realize was that quiet people often spend long periods simply observing. And observation has a strange effect over time. Eventually, patterns begin to reveal themselves. The shift didn't happen during one of Daniel's trips. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 weeks after that dinner at Mark and Julia's apartment. I was working from home that day. Rain had been falling steadily since morning, the kind of quiet, consistent drizzle that Seattle seems to specialize in. My apartment windows were slightly fogged, and the room smelled faintly like the tea I had made earlier. On my desk was the leather-bound notebook I had carried for years. Most people would find it unremarkable. It wasn't decorative or expensive, just simple brown leather, the edges softened from being carried in bags and briefcases. Inside were pages of notes, expense tracking, random observations, lists of things I wanted to remember. Writing things down has always helped me organize my thoughts. It's something I started doing early in my career when I realized that memory is powerful, but written patterns are stronger. That afternoon, I was reviewing some personal expenses from the previous month: groceries, utilities, subscriptions. Then I opened a folder where I kept receipts that Daniel occasionally asked me to scan for his reimbursements. The restaurant receipt from Portland was still there. I hadn't thought about it much since that night. It had simply remained in the file like any other document. But this time, when I looked at it, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before: the name of the restaurant. Not just the name itself, but the location printed beneath it. It wasn't in the financial district where Daniel had said most of his meetings took place. It was across the river, in a smaller neighborhood known more for boutique hotels and quiet streets than corporate offices. That detail didn't prove anything, but it triggered a familiar sensation in my mind. The same feeling I get when reviewing financial records that almost, but not quite, fit the expected pattern. Curiosity. Not suspicion, not yet, just a professional instinct that something deserved a closer look. So I did something very simple. I opened a map on my laptop and searched for the restaurant. Images appeared immediately: soft lighting, outdoor seating, a place clearly designed for long, slow dinners rather than quick business meetings. I studied the photos for a moment. Then I closed the window. I didn't feel angry. In fact, I felt strangely calm. because the realization forming in my mind wasn't about the restaurant at all. It was about how easily information can be verified. Daniel had always spoken about his trips as if they existed in a world separate from mine, a space defined only by the brief details he chose to share. But the modern world doesn't work that way anymore. Flights leave digital records. Restaurants keep timestamps. Locations leave small traces everywhere. For years, I had simply chosen not to examine those traces. Not because they were hidden, but because trust made examination unnecessary. That afternoon, sitting quietly at my desk with the rain tapping against the windows, I understood something clearly. If I ever wanted answers, they were probably already there. The real question wasn't whether information existed. The real question was whether I wanted to look for it. I closed my notebook and sat back in my chair for a long moment. The apartment was silent except for the rain. That was the exact moment something inside me changed, not dramatically, just a quiet internal decision. For the first time in years, I decided I would begin paying closer attention, not confronting, not accusing, just observing. And the strange thing about observation is that once you begin doing it deliberately, you start noticing things that were always there. After that Wednesday afternoon, nothing in my behavior changed, at least not in any way Daniel could notice. That was intentional. Most people assume that when someone begins to suspect something in a relationship, their behavior shifts immediately. They ask more questions, they become tense, their voice carries an edge. But my instinct moved in the opposite direction. I became quieter. Not out of fear, out of clarity. Silence, when chosen deliberately, can be a very useful place to observe from. A week later, Daniel announced another trip. Portland again, he said one evening while rinsing a coffee mug in the sink. I was sitting at the dining table reviewing a work document. When do you leave? I asked. Friday afternoon. Same pattern, same city, same casual tone. In the past, I might have asked which client he was seeing or how long the meetings would last. Those questions had once been normal, but this time I simply nodded. Okay, I said. That was all. If Daniel noticed the simplicity of my response, he didn't show it. Over the next 2 days, I paid attention to small things. The way he packed his suitcase, the emails he checked while sitting on the couch, the timing of his phone notifications. None of it seemed particularly suspicious. But observation rarely produces immediate answers. What it produces instead are reference points. And reference points eventually form patterns. Friday afternoon arrived. Daniel rolled his navy suitcase into the hallway just after 3 o'clock, exactly as he always did. I heard the familiar sound of the handle locking into place. He stepped into the living room where I was working. Back Sunday night, he said, the same sentence he had used for years. I looked up from my laptop and gave a small smile. Safe flight. He leaned down and kissed the top of my head before leaving. The front door closed softly behind him. The apartment grew quiet again. For a few minutes, I remained where I was, listening to the faint sound of rain outside. Then I did something very simple. I opened my notebook. On a blank page, I wrote 3 lines. Trip, Portland departure, Friday 3:20 p.m. return, Sunday night expected. That was all. No accusations, no conclusions, just a record. The action itself took less than 10 seconds, but the meaning behind it was different from anything I had done before. For the first time, Daniel's trips were no longer just part of our routine. They had become data, something to observe, something to understand. Over the next 2 days, I continued my normal weekend activities. Groceries, laundry, a walk along the waterfront on Saturday morning. Occasionally, Daniel sent short messages. Landed. Long day of meetings. Talk tomorrow. I replied each time politely. Nothing in our communication sounded unusual, and yet something had quietly shifted inside my perspective. Because once you begin documenting something, you start noticing the spaces between the details. The timing of messages, the length of responses, the absence of certain information. By Sunday evening, Daniel returned home exactly when he said he would. Suitcase rolling across the hardwood floor, stories about long meetings, the usual rhythm. If he had looked at me carefully that night, he might have noticed a difference. But most people don't study calm faces very closely. They assume calm means nothing is happening beneath the surface. What Daniel didn't realize was that my silence had stopped being passive. It had become intentional. And intention changes the way every small detail is received. because the next time something didn't quite align, I would be ready to see it. The interesting thing about quiet observation is that most people never realize it's happening. Life continued exactly as it always had. Daniel traveled. I worked. Our home remained calm and orderly. From the outside, nothing about our marriage looked different. But inside my notebook, small entries had begun to accumulate. Dates, times, cities, nothing complicated, just simple records of the trips Daniel described so casually. Portland, Friday departure, Sunday return. Portland, 2 weeks later. Portland again the following month. After 3 months, the pattern was unmistakable. Every trip was to the same city. That alone wasn't suspicious. Many consultants work with the same client repeatedly. What caught my attention was something else: the frequency. Sometimes the trips came only 2 weeks apart, occasionally just 10 days, and yet Daniel had once described the project as a quarterly review contract. That detail stayed in my mind. Quarterly reviews rarely require travel every 2 weeks. Still, I didn't confront him. Confrontation without understanding rarely produces useful answers. Instead, I continued observing. One evening in late winter, while Daniel was in the shower, his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I wasn't looking for it. In fact, I almost ignored it. But the screen lit up long enough for a notification to appear. Flight reminder, gate assignment available. The airline name was visible: Alaska Airlines. That, by itself, meant nothing, but after the shower, when Daniel came into the kitchen, I asked a simple question. Which airline do you usually take to Portland? He dried his hair with a towel and answered without hesitation. Delta most of the time. His voice was casual, confident. The kind of confidence people have when they believe their answer won't be checked. I nodded. Good to know, I said. And the conversation moved on. Later that night, after Daniel had fallen asleep, I opened my laptop in the living room. Airline flight schedules are publicly available information. Within minutes, I discovered something simple. There were no Delta flights from Seattle to Portland at the time Daniel usually left on Fridays. Only Alaska Airlines. Again, it wasn't proof of anything, but it was another small piece that didn't fit the story as cleanly as it should have. I wrote 2 lines in my notebook: observed airline notification, Alaska, stated airline, Delta. Still, I said nothing. Weeks passed. Then another small detail appeared. One Sunday evening, when Daniel returned home, I was folding laundry in the bedroom while he unpacked his suitcase. His laptop charger slipped from the side pocket and landed on the floor. I bent down to pick it up, and for a brief moment, I saw something attached to the suitcase handle that I had never noticed before: a hotel luggage tag. It was small, made of clear plastic, with a printed card inside. The name of the hotel was visible. It wasn't one of the large business hotels downtown. It was a boutique hotel in the same neighborhood as the restaurant from the receipt, the quiet area across the river. I didn't react. I simply handed him the charger. Your cable fell out, I said. Thanks, he replied, sliding it back into the pocket. If Daniel noticed that I had seen the luggage tag, he didn't show it. But that night, after he went to bed, I wrote another entry. Hotel, Riverside Quarter Boutique Hotel, observed luggage tag. Then I searched for the hotel online. The photos told a clear story: soft lighting, balconies overlooking the river, rooms designed for long weekend stays. Not business conferences, not corporate meetings, just quiet, elegant rooms designed for privacy. I closed the browser and sat back in my chair. For the first time since beginning my quiet observations, the pattern forming in my notebook felt less abstract, not confirmed, but clearer. Daniel wasn't just traveling frequently to the same city. He was staying in the same small neighborhood, dining in the same intimate restaurants, returning home with stories that contained fewer and fewer specifics. Still, I didn't feel anger. What I felt was something closer to professional focus, the kind of focus that appears when a complicated puzzle begins to reveal its structure. Because the truth about patterns is simple. Once you see enough pieces, the final shape becomes difficult to ignore. And soon, I would discover a piece that changed everything. By the time spring arrived, my notebook contained nearly 5 months of small observations. On their own, none of the entries were dramatic. A flight notification, a hotel name, the timing of messages, receipts. Daniel occasionally asked me to scan. Each detail was ordinary, but together, they formed something else entirely: a pattern. Patterns are difficult to ignore once they become visible. That's something I had learned long before my marriage, working in financial compliance. Fraud rarely announces itself loudly. Instead, it appears through tiny inconsistencies, numbers that don't quite match the story they're supposed to support. Daniel's trips had started to feel like that kind of report, mostly consistent, but not completely. The moment that finally brought clarity happened on a quiet Saturday morning. Daniel had left early for another trip the afternoon before. As usual, the apartment was calm in his absence. I made coffee, opened the windows slightly to let in the cool spring air, and sat down at the dining table with my laptop. There was a small stack of travel receipts beside me. Daniel had asked me to scan them for reimbursement earlier in the week, something I had done dozens of times before. Most of them were routine: airport coffee, taxi fare, a hotel charge, but one receipt was different. It was from the same boutique hotel whose luggage tag I had seen months earlier. Riverside Quarter Boutique Hotel. I examined the printed details carefully. 2 nights. Friday check-in, Sunday checkout. That part aligned with the trips Daniel described. But another line caught my attention. Room type: Deluxe River Suite. Double occupancy. I read the words again slowly. Double occupancy doesn't automatically mean two people are present. Hotels often list that by default, but combined with everything else I had observed, it felt significant. Still, I resisted jumping to conclusions. Instead, I did something very simple. I opened the hotel's website. Room descriptions appeared on the screen: photos, amenities, pricing. The Deluxe River Suite was designed for couples: one large bed, a balcony facing the water, a small dining area beside the window. Not the type of room most consultants book for a quick weekend work trip. I sat there for a long moment, looking at the images. What surprised me most wasn't the information itself. It was how calm I felt while looking at it. I wasn't shaking, I wasn't crying, I was simply processing the pattern that had been forming for months. Daniel's trips were consistent in ways that had nothing to do with work: the same city, the same neighborhood, the same hotel, and now, apparently, the same type of room. Still, I didn't feel a sudden rush to confront him. That reaction might have come years earlier, when the first receipt appeared. But now the situation felt different, because once a pattern becomes clear, the emotional question changes. It's no longer, "Is this happening?" It becomes, "What do I do with the knowledge?" I closed the laptop and walked to the window. The street below was quiet, the early morning light reflecting softly off the wet pavement. For several minutes, I simply stood there thinking, not about betrayal, not about anger, but about options. Because clarity creates choices. I could confront Daniel immediately when he returned Sunday night. I could demand explanations, argue about details, and insist on answers. Or I could continue doing exactly what I had been doing: observing, documenting, understanding the situation completely before deciding how to respond. In my profession, acting too early often destroys the evidence needed to understand a situation fully. The same principle seemed strangely applicable here. So I returned to the dining table and opened my notebook again. On a fresh page, I wrote a single line: Riverside Quarter, Boutique Hotel, Deluxe River Suite, double occupancy. Then I closed the notebook. For the first time since this quiet investigation began, I knew something with near certainty. Daniel's trips weren't what he said they were. But knowing that truth wasn't the most important part. The most important part was deciding what came next. Once clarity arrives, life becomes strangely quiet. Not externally, the world continues exactly as it always has. But internally, the noise disappears. That Saturday morning, after discovering the hotel receipt, I spent several hours thinking about what I had learned. Not analyzing Daniel's behavior, that part had already become fairly clear. Instead, I was thinking about my own choices. When people imagine moments like this, they often picture dramatic reactions: raised voices, accusations, emotional confrontations across kitchen tables late at night. But reality is rarely that theatrical. In real life, the most important decisions usually happen alone, in silence. I made lunch that afternoon and sat by the window, watching people walk their dogs along the wet sidewalk. And I considered 3 options. The first option was the simplest: immediate confrontation. When Daniel returned Sunday evening, I could place the receipt on the table and ask a direct question. "Why are you booking a couple's suite in Portland?" The problem with that approach was obvious. Daniel is intelligent. He works in consulting, where explaining complicated situations convincingly is part of the job. If I confronted him without preparation, he would almost certainly produce an explanation. Maybe a colleague joined him later. Maybe the hotel upgraded the room automatically. Maybe the receipt description was generic. None of those explanations would necessarily be true, but they might be plausible enough to blur the situation. And once confusion enters a conversation, the truth becomes much harder to separate from the story. The second option was quieter. Ignore everything. I could close the notebook, stop looking at receipts, and allow life to return to its previous rhythm. Many people choose this path, not because they're weak, but because certainty can be painful. Uncertainty allows life to continue without disruption. I understood that temptation completely, but something inside me had already crossed a line. Once you begin seeing patterns, pretending they don't exist requires more energy than simply acknowledging them. Which left the third option: continue observing, but with purpose. Not out of suspicion, not out of revenge, but to understand the full reality of the situation before deciding what kind of future I wanted. That option felt right. Not dramatic, not impulsive, just deliberate. So that afternoon, I made a quiet decision. I would not confront Daniel yet. Instead, I would gather enough clarity to ensure that when the time came to make a choice about my life, it would be based on complete understanding rather than emotional reaction. This decision didn't require any dramatic changes in my behavior. I simply continued doing what I had been doing for months, documenting small details, observing patterns, listening carefully to the explanations Daniel offered about his trips. And over the following weeks, something interesting began to happen. Once I had accepted the possibility that Daniel's trips were not what he claimed, my attention started noticing details I had previously dismissed without thought. The timing of flights, the length of text messages, even the tone of his voice when describing certain weekends. Each observation added another small piece to the picture. Not dramatic pieces, just quiet confirmations. And gradually, the question I had once been asking, "Is something happening?" transformed into a different question entirely, not about Daniel, but about me. Because eventually, understanding a situation fully leads to a point where observation is no longer enough. At some point, a decision must be made. And that moment was approaching faster than Daniel realized. Once I had made the decision not to confront Daniel immediately, something inside my mind became very structured. The emotional part of the situation didn't disappear, but it stepped aside long enough for something else to take the lead. Planning, not in a dramatic sense. I wasn't plotting revenge or imagining some moment where the truth would explode across the room. What I was doing was far simpler. I was preparing my life for the possibility that the marriage I believed I had might not be the one I was actually living in. And preparation, I've learned, is most effective when it happens quietly. The first step was something practical. One Tuesday afternoon during my lunch break, I scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor downtown. On the calendar invitation, it simply read, "Long-term planning consultation," which technically was true. Daniel and I had shared finances for years. Our mortgage, savings accounts, and investment plans were organized jointly. I had always trusted that arrangement, but trust and clarity are not the same thing. So during that meeting, I asked questions, not accusatory questions, just practical ones. What would happen financially if two people who share assets decide to separate? What documentation matters most? How does property division work in our state? The advisor answered calmly, explaining processes and options in the same neutral tone professionals use when discussing retirement planning. To anyone overhearing the conversation, it would have sounded like a standard financial discussion, and in many ways, it was. The difference was simply that I was now paying attention to details I had never needed to consider before. After that meeting, I made another small adjustment. I opened a personal savings account, not to hide money, just to create independence, a place where my own income could exist separately if I ever needed it. Again, nothing dramatic, just preparation. At home, Daniel remained exactly the same. He continued describing his Portland trips in broad, uncomplicated terms. Long meetings, client reviews, exhausting weekends. I listened the way I always had, calmly, patiently, occasionally asking small questions that seemed harmless on the surface. "What hotel are you staying in this time?" Same client again? The answers were usually vague, just the usual place. Yeah, same project. Each response quietly confirmed what my notebook had already shown. Meanwhile, I made one more change. I began organizing our household documents. Tax records, mortgage agreements, insurance policies. Everything was scanned and stored neatly in a private digital folder. Daniel never questioned it. In fact, if he noticed at all, he probably assumed I was simply doing what I had always done, keeping our life organized. Which, technically, I was. The difference was that now I was organizing it with a future in mind. A future that might look very different from the one we had built together. What surprised me most during this period wasn't Daniel's behavior. It was my own emotional state. I wasn't angry, I wasn't anxious. If anything, I felt focused, like someone slowly rearranging furniture in a familiar room, preparing it for a different purpose. Because the truth about quiet preparation is this: when you begin adjusting your life silently, other people rarely notice. They continue moving through the same routines, believing everything remains unchanged. Daniel still packed his navy suitcase every few weeks, still kissed the top of my head before leaving, still returned Sunday evenings with stories about meetings that never seemed to have specific names. What he didn't realize was that the foundation beneath our routine had already started to shift. Not dramatically, just carefully, piece by piece. And by the time he finally noticed, it would already be too late to put everything back the way it was. The interesting thing about quiet decisions is that their consequences often begin long before anyone realizes a decision has been made. From Daniel's perspective, life continued exactly the same. He traveled to Portland. He returned on Matdagan nights. We shared dinners during the week and watched shows in the evenings. Nothing about my behavior appeared dramatic enough to raise concern, but small shifts had already begun. The first change was subtle. For years, Daniel had relied on me to handle many of the quiet logistical details of our life together. I scheduled maintenance appointments for the house, renewed insurance policies, and managed the calendar for family visits. It wasn't something he demanded. It had simply become our pattern. But gradually, I stopped doing certain things automatically. When the car needed service, I mentioned it once and left the decision to him. When our streaming subscription expired, I didn't renew it immediately. When his mother texted about planning a summer visit, I forwarded the message to him instead of answering on our behalf. None of these actions was dramatic, but they created a small space where Daniel had to begin noticing things that had previously been invisible. One evening, he stood in the kitchen looking at the coffee machine. "Didn't we usually have more filters?" he asked. "I think we ran out last week," I said calmly. "Oh." He opened a cabinet, looked briefly inside, then shrugged and poured coffee through a folded paper towel instead. The moment passed quickly, but it was the first time I saw a hint of mild confusion in his expression, not suspicion. Just the quiet realization that certain parts of his routine no longer arranged themselves automatically. The second shift appeared a few weeks later. Daniel returned from another Portland trip late on a Sunday evening. I was sitting in the living room reading when he walked in with his suitcase. "Hey," he said, setting the bag down. "You're still up." "I finished my book," I replied. He looked around the room briefly. "Did we cancel the cleaning service?" he asked. "No," I said. Then I paused slightly before adding, "The payment card on file expired last month." Daniel frowned. "Oh, I thought you handled that." "I usually did," I said gently. He nodded and carried his suitcase into the bedroom. The next morning, I noticed him searching through his email for the cleaning company's contact information. Again, nothing dramatic, just small inconveniences. But those inconveniences created something Daniel had rarely experienced before: awareness. For the first time in years, he had to manage small aspects of his own life that had previously been handled quietly in the background. And with awareness comes something else: perspective. Over the next few weeks, similar moments occurred: bills that required attention, appointments that needed scheduling, household details that no longer arranged themselves invisibly. Daniel never accused me of changing, he simply adapted. But I could see something slowly developing in his expression during those moments, a subtle curiosity, as if he were beginning to wonder why the smooth, invisible structure of our home life felt slightly different. Meanwhile, I continued behaving exactly as I always had: calm, polite, supportive in conversation. From the outside, nothing suggested conflict, but internally, the quiet rebalancing had already begun. Because relationships often contain unseen structures, habits, responsibilities, emotional labor that one person carries without discussion. And when that structure begins to shift, the effects travel outward slowly, like the gentle movement of furniture in a familiar room. Daniel hadn't yet realized that something fundamental had changed, but the first consequences of that change had already started appearing, small enough to ignore, at least for now. By early summer, the quiet shifts in our lives had accumulated in ways Daniel could no longer completely ignore. Not because anything dramatic had happened, but because the smooth rhythm he had grown used to was now slightly uneven. Small things kept requiring his attention. The car registration reminder arrived in the mail and sat unopened on the kitchen counter for 3 days before he noticed it. The grocery list stopped appearing on the refrigerator door the way it used to. And when his sister called one evening asking about Thanksgiving plans, Daniel hesitated before answering. Fidelia usually organizes that, he said into the phone. Then he glanced across the room at me. I smiled politely and returned to the book in my hands. He ended the call a few minutes later, looking mildly puzzled. Are we hosting this year? He asked. We could, I said calmly, if you'd like to. He nodded slowly, as if adjusting to the idea that the decision now belonged partly to him. These moments didn't create arguments, but they created something else. A subtle sense that the invisible systems supporting his routine had begun to loosen. Around the same time, another development happened quietly in the background. One afternoon, I received an email confirming that the personal savings account I had opened months earlier had reached a comfortable balance. I didn't celebrate. I simply noted the number and closed the browser window. Preparation rarely feels dramatic while it's happening. It feels methodical, measured, and by that point, several other preparations had already been completed. Legal consultations had clarified my options. Financial records were organized and stored securely. Important documents had been copied. Everything was ready. The only thing left was the moment when the situation would finally become visible to Daniel. That moment arrived sooner than I expected. One Thursday evening, Daniel walked into the living room holding his laptop. His expression carried the focused look he often had when something at work required attention. Hey, he said, sitting down across from me. Quick question. I closed my notebook and looked up. What's up? I was checking our joint credit card statement, he said. Did something change with the automatic transfers to our savings account? His tone wasn't accusatory, just curious. I had expected that question eventually. Yes, I said simply. I adjusted the allocations a few months ago. Daniel frowned slightly. You didn't mention that. I didn't think it was urgent, I replied. He studied me for a moment, as if deciding whether to ask another question. Then he nodded. Okay. But the conversation left something unsettled in the room. For the first time, Daniel had noticed a financial change he hadn't initiated. It wasn't large enough to cause immediate concern, but it was significant enough to suggest that parts of our shared life were now moving independently of his awareness. Over the following days, I noticed him checking a few things more carefully, looking through statements, asking brief questions about scheduling. Nothing confrontational, just attentive. It reminded me of the moment months earlier when I first began noticing patterns in his travel, that quiet shift from routine to observation. The difference, of course, was that my preparations had already been completed. Daniel was only beginning to sense that something might be different. And by the time someone begins looking for answers, the most important decisions have often already been made. The structure of our life together had quietly changed. Not loudly, not emotionally, just permanently. And Daniel was about to discover that some changes cannot be undone once they've reached a certain point. The conversation finally happened on a quiet Sunday evening. Daniel had just returned from another trip to Portland. His suitcase rested near the hallway wall, still closed, as if he hadn't yet decided whether to unpack or sit down first. I was in the kitchen preparing tea. The apartment was calm, the late sunlight stretching across the wooden floor. Long weekend? I asked gently as I poured hot water into 2 cups. Yeah, Daniel replied, loosening the collar of his shirt. Meetings ran later than expected. His answer sounded exactly like dozens of others he had given over the years. Routine, predictable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I carried the tea to the dining table and sat down. Daniel, I said quietly. He looked up, There was no accusation in my voice, which seemed to surprise him slightly. "Can we talk for a few minutes?" "Sure," he said, pulling out the chair across from me. I folded my hands loosely around the warm cup. "I've been noticing something over the past several months," I began. Daniel leaned back slightly, listening. "Your trips to Portland," I continued, "they've become very consistent." His expression remained neutral. "It's the same client," he said. "You know that. I know that's what you've said." The room stayed calm. No raised voices. No sharp movements. Just two people sitting across from each other, at the same table where we had eaten dinner together hundreds of times. "I also noticed something else," I added. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with focus. "What do you mean?" I paused for a moment before answering. "I saw the receipt from the Riverside Quarter Hotel." For the first time, Daniel's posture changed. Not dramatically, but enough that I could see his attention sharpen. "That's where I usually stay," he said carefully. "Yes," I replied. Another short silence passed. Then I continued. "The room listed on the receipt was a deluxe river suite." Daniel didn't speak immediately. His eyes moved briefly to the window, then back to me. "Sometimes hotels upgrade rooms," he said. "That can happen," I agreed. Again, my voice stayed calm. I wasn't challenging him. I was simply acknowledging the information. "And I noticed the restaurant receipt from the same neighborhood a few months ago," I added. Daniel exhaled slowly. Not angrily, more like someone realizing a conversation had reached a point where casual explanations might not be enough. "So what are you saying?" he asked quietly. I looked at him for a moment before answering. "I'm saying that I've spent the past several months paying attention to details that I didn't examine before." There was no tension in my tone, just clarity. Daniel rested his elbows on the table, thinking. "And?" he asked. The word hung gently in the air between us. I took a small sip of tea before responding. "And I've realized something important," I said. "What?" "That the story you've been telling about these trips doesn't fully match the information around them." Daniel didn't interrupt. For the first time since we started speaking, he looked uncertain about what to say next. Not defensive, just aware. Aware that the quiet version of me, the one he had always assumed would never examine details, had been observing far more than he realized. The silence between us stretched for several seconds. Then Daniel asked the question that had been forming in his mind since the beginning of the conversation. "What happens now?" I set my cup down gently. "That," I said, "is the part I've already thought about." When Daniel asked, "What happens now?" the room remained as calm as it had been since the beginning of our conversation. There was no tension in the air, no raised voices, just two people sitting across from each other, finally acknowledging something that had quietly existed for a long time. I looked at him for a moment before answering. "Now," I said gently, "we move forward honestly." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying my face as if trying to understand something unfamiliar. Not anger, not sadness, just composure. For years, he had known me as someone patient, supportive, and calm, but calm and unaware are not the same thing. "I should have asked you sooner," he said after a moment. The sentence sounded sincere, and I believed he meant it. But sincerity doesn't always change outcomes. I shook my head slightly. "You didn't ask because you believed I wouldn't look closely," I said. Daniel didn't argue with that. Instead, he looked down at the table for a moment. "What are you planning to do?" he asked quietly. The question was direct, not defensive, just honest. I folded my hands in front of me. "Over the past few months," I said, "I've taken time to understand my options." Daniel's eyes lifted again. "Options?" he repeated. "Yes." I spoke calmly, the way someone explains a decision they have already accepted internally. "I've organized our financial records, I've spoken with an advisor, and I've prepared for the possibility that our marriage might not continue the way it has." Daniel absorbed that information slowly. "You've been planning this for months?" he asked. "I've been preparing," I said. "There's a difference between planning an ending and preparing for change. Preparation simply means you're ready to make a clear decision when the moment arrives." Daniel rubbed his hands together thoughtfully. "I didn't realize you felt this way," he said. "I didn't feel this way at first," I replied. "That's the interesting thing about attention." I paused briefly before continuing. When you start observing the details of a situation honestly, your understanding changes. Daniel nodded slowly. Neither of us tried to revisit the past in that moment. No long explanations, no dramatic confessions, just recognition. Because the truth is, relationships rarely end in a single moment. They shift gradually, one small realization at a time, until eventually the person you thought you were beside becomes someone you see more clearly. I looked around the apartment we had shared for years, the bookshelf we assembled together, the kitchen table where we had eaten thousands of meals, the quiet rhythm of a life that had once felt simple. "I'm not angry with you," I said. Daniel looked surprised by that. "I'm not," I repeated. Anger would mean I was still trying to change what already happened. Instead, what I felt was something calmer: acceptance, clarity, and perhaps most importantly, independence. For the first time in years, my future didn't feel like something defined by someone else's explanations or choices. It felt like something I could design for myself. Daniel looked at me for a long moment. "I underestimated you," he said quietly. I smiled slightly. "Most people underestimate quiet people," I replied. "But quiet doesn't mean unaware. It simply means we take longer to speak. And when we finally do, the words usually come after a great deal of thought." For a long time after Daniel left the apartment that evening, I stood by the window and watched the rain fall against the glass. Seattle rain has a particular rhythm to it: soft, steady, almost meditative. It has a way of slowing your thoughts down until everything becomes clearer. I realized something important that night. Not about Daniel, about myself. For years, I believed patience meant enduring things quietly. I believed loyalty meant trusting without questioning. And I believed that keeping the peace was always the right thing to do. But patience isn't the same as silence. And loyalty isn't the same as blindness. What I learned through all of this is that awareness is a quiet form of strength. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand attention. But once it wakes up, it never goes back to sleep. People often think power looks loud. They imagine dramatic confrontations, emotional speeches, or moments where someone finally explodes after years of mistreatment. But in my experience, the most powerful decisions are rarely dramatic. They happen quietly. They happen when someone sits alone with their thoughts and decides they deserve a life built on truth rather than convenience. I never screamed at Daniel. I never tried to humiliate him. I never needed to prove anything in a loud way. Because by the time the truth became clear, the most important work had already happened inside me. I had stopped pretending not to see. And sometimes, that single shift changes everything. Today, when people meet me, they often describe me the same way they always have: calm, patient, quiet. They're not wrong. The only difference now is that I understand exactly what those qualities mean. Quiet people are not empty. They are observing. They are thinking. And when they finally decide to act, the decision has usually been forming for a very long time. So if there's one thing I would leave you with from this story, it's this: never assume that someone's silence means they are unaware. Sometimes it simply means they are waiting for the moment when the truth is impossible to ignore. And when that moment comes, everything changes. Now, I'd really like to hear from you. Have you ever discovered a small detail that completely changed the way you saw someone you trusted? Or have you ever realized much later that you had been noticing the truth all along, but hadn't been ready to face it yet? Share your experience in the comments. I read more of them than you might think.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.